Hello, my name's Bob Ward, and I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event on COP30 and beyond, what happened in Belém. We have an excellent panel of individuals who were all at COP30 at various stages, some from the bitter start to the bitter end, who will give a kind of overview for 10 minutes each on their perspective. And then after each of the panelists have given their point of view, there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So you can drop your questions into the Q&A section, not into the chat, which should be disabled, but into the Q&A section, and I will read out questions. So this is, before I introduce the panel, a few other aspects of the housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the Grantham Research Institute website shortly after we complete it. So if your presence in the audience is meant to be a secret, I suggest you take that into account when asking a question. We'll try and keep on time. We have a total of 90 minutes in total for this event, and we'll see how we get on during that period. So now we have the following panelists who will speak in this order. We have Kate Hughes, very lucky to have Kate Hughes, the lead climate negotiator for the UK. We have Nicholas Stern, the chair of the Grantham Research Institute and the Global School of Sustainability at the LSE, and also co-chair of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance. We have Jodianne Wang, who is a policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute in the Just Transition Finance Lab. And we have Tima Leiter, who's a distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute and was leading on the expert analysis of the adaptation indicators, of which we will hear much more later from Timo. We're very lucky to have Kate with us today. Fortunately, she only has a very short amount of time, so she will be leaving us shortly after giving her overview. But without further delay, I'm going to invite Kate to offer her contribution, and then we will move on to Nick. So, Kate, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you for inviting me along. And you said some of us have been there from the bitter start to the bitter end, and that included me. So I got home on Monday after 3 weeks in Belém. So yeah, let me give an overview from my perspective from the UK, and I guess largely from the negotiation side, as to what happened at COP. And it would be great to hear some of the other reflections here as well. And let me start by saying that, COPs are many, many things, and this one was no different in that way. And perhaps this one also brought more elements to it as well. And just in terms of the format, we had the World Leaders Summit as a separate couple of days before COP even got going, where we saw a huge number of world leaders come together to talk about these issues. We then have all of the different action agenda elements of the COP, the pavilions, the kind of the coalitions of the willing, a huge amount of momentum in that led from Brazil as well. And then, of course, the negotiations too. And all three of those kind of play their different part, play their different role in what the outcomes from COP look like and feel like, and what we actually achieved. And they all interrelate as well. So just in terms of the brief headlines of what happened at COP and what we achieved, for me, the headline was that over 190 countries were there in Belém and recommitted to multilateralism and to 1.5 degrees. And that wasn't a given, I don't think, at the start of the year or throughout the year. So the fact that that happened and that countries turned up and engaged and came to an agreement on the negotiations is actually not to be underestimated. And actually, we made a lot of progress, both inside and outside the negotiations. We wanted more as the UK, and I think you might well have seen this from what we've said since and some interviews that our Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, has given. We did want more. We did want to go further in terms of ambition. But actually, the nature of multilateralism is that we do things by consensus, that everyone comes together, that we move forward together, and that we're stronger because of that, because everyone is committed to the outcomes that are agreed. But of course, it shows where some of those fault lines are between different countries and between different parties and positions. But it also shows where we can agree and where we can actually then build on what's said. And again, it's that interplay between the coalitions of the willing and what happens outside the negotiations and what happens inside. And in terms of kind of the feel of the COP, actually, Brazil did a great job in terms of the logistics, in terms of getting us all there. And again, as Ed Miliband has said in an op-ed over the weekend, it was indeed sweaty, maddening, and sleepless. But we expect nothing less from a COP in the Amazon. So let me touch briefly on what happened outside the negotiations. And I should start with forests. This was a COP that was held in the Amazon in order to draw attention to forests and the importance of forests, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And we were really pleased to see the launch of the TFFF, which was a landmark for Brazil. And the UK was integral to its design and development, and we will continue to work with Brazil on this. We also led and co-chaired the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, the FCLP, with Guyana, which we set up during COP26, and that brought outcomes on forest finance and on carbon markets, showing that actually, again, how we can come together with different countries to make progress on those issues. On clean energy, there was a huge amount of momentum, with over 80 countries coming together to support a roadmap on the transition away from fossil fuels. And that built up a real head of steam over week 2 in particular as well. And the presidency in the closing plenary announced that they would be taking forward 2 roadmaps on those issues. So one on fossil fuels and the transition, and one on forests, which we were very pleased to see, and we are supportive of both. We also worked on methane and super pollutants and had a declaration to accelerate action there, working on that particularly with Brazil and China. And we launched the first call for proposals under the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. On the Global Clean Power Alliance, we co-launched a new energy investment planning roadmap, and we announced 5 action plans with country and regional partners. And we had 3 new countries join the Powering Past Coal Alliance: Guatemala, Bahrain, and South Korea. And South Korea is the 7th largest coal-producing country, so that is really important progress. So that just kind of gives you hopefully a bit of a snapshot as to what was happening in terms of those big coalitions of the willing, what was happening across some of the big issues across the World Leaders Summit, and in the rooms and the pavilions, and showing where progress can be made. Inside the negotiations, most of my time as the head of delegation, and then when ministers joined us as well in week 2, we spent most of our time on the headline issues and then what became the Mutual decision, and talking about the headline issues about 1.5 and NDC and ambition on finance, and particularly adaptation finance, and also on trade. And that culminated, as hopefully you did see in this Mutual decision, a word which comes from indigenous communities in Brazil about working together, each person in a team playing their own role towards this kind of collective goal, and each person doing their best towards delivering what they can do and bringing the skills and expertise that each person can bring. So it was a very useful framing for us as we went through these hours talking through what we wanted to achieve on all of that. And our Brazilian hosts often called that a therapy session, and we needed to be sending him love letters on how we would make progress on these issues. And for me, the headlines from that decision, and if you read it, much of the text over the first few pages is about celebrating the decade since Paris, the progress that's been made, and how we're going to continue to work together to go further on all of this. there's a really clear call to strive to be more ambitious, to strengthen NDCs, and to recognise how far we've come. And on that, we've been talking a lot about how when we headed into Paris, we were going towards 4 degrees of warming. And certainly on the NDCs, as we saw them earlier this year, we are now heading for 2.3 to 2.5 degrees of warming. Still too much, but we think that it shows how this process does actually work, how it helps to helps to provide the framework for countries to act and to have the confidence that everyone is working together. As I said, we did want more on this in the final text. We secured links to the global stocktake in the final decision as well, and links therefore to the decisions within that on fossil fuels and on forests. And there were concerns in terms of how far we went on this, because what we have in Paris is a process that doesn't tell individual countries what to do. It is nationally determined. And so we wanted to get right the balance between not telling countries what they should do, but enabling and creating the space where we could actually all work together towards these outcomes. And that's what we see in much of the text in terms of the acceleration agenda towards 1.5 and the mission there that we agreed to in the text. We reached an outcome on the global goal on adaptation, and I know you'll be covering a bit more in this during the webinar as well. But we know that we now need to refine this further. We need to engage in Bonn. We need to make sure that we've got the right set of indicators now, in particular, that we can take forward and use, albeit on a voluntary basis, but that's very important, and that people can actually start using and testing and learning from, and using those to inform their adaptation plans, and learning about the data and how we can understand that. On finance, I think we made some good progress too. So last year, as I'm sure many of you know, in the new collective quantified goal, we agreed that by 2035, we would need to mobilise at least $300 billion of climate finance a year for developing countries. And this year, we agreed that within that 300 billion, we would need to target our efforts and aim to treble climate finance flowing to adaptation and resilience. This was a big call from particularly the LDCs, and I'm pleased that we managed to find a way through to signal our efforts towards doing that over the coming 10 years. We also welcomed the Baku to Belém roadmap on climate finance as well. On trade, we've got an agreement to have an open and supportive, cooperative space to talk about trade, and to have 3 dialogues over the next 3 years, including with organisations like the World Trade Organization as well. We've got good references to science, and particularly to the IPCC, and recognising the IPCC as kind of the core source of that best available science as well. We made progress on just transitions and linking just transitions to 1.5 degrees, and a mechanism to bring coherence to facilitating 1.5 aligned pathways on just transitions, but including how those relate to the clean energy transition as well. On carbon markets, there was a huge outcome in terms of winding down the Kyoto era carbon market mechanisms and taking the funds that we still have there so that they can be transferred to other Paris mechanisms and funds, including on things like adaptation, which I think is really exciting. And there were also really great outcomes on things like transparency, on the gender action plan, and on technology. So a whole range of areas that made some really, really good progress sitting underneath that kind of covered decision that came together in the final hours as well. Of course, there were challenges. Again, it wouldn't be multilateralism. It wouldn't be over 190 countries coming together to agree a way through if there weren't challenges. And if you were watching, you would have seen some of those challenges to how the decisions went through and the time allocated to them, which is why we'll be coming back to spend more time on the global goal and adaptation and the indicators. And it wasn't helped despite the great logistics by the Brazilian presidency, but we did lose at least half a day of negotiating time to a fire very close to the end, which, as I say, slightly increased the pressure on the final few hours of the COP. So that's in brief, given the time that I've got, hopefully a good overview of what we achieved through the negotiations. I think we're still absorbing and digesting exactly what we came out with, and we'll be thinking that through over the next few weeks and months, and then looking forward to COP31. So the Brazilian presidency obviously carries on with their ambitious agenda, particularly on fossil fuels and on forests, and we'll be then working out how we engage with the next hosts, the COP31 hosts. So we will have Turkey as the actual hosts, but Australia will take on the role of president of the negotiations, and they will start running that now until the end of COP31, and the pre-COP will be in the Pacific. So we're entering kind of a new kind of arrangement that we'll have to understand in terms of this relationship between Australia and Turkey as well, in terms of the next COP. So thank you, Bob. Hopefully that gave you a bit of an overview. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed, Kate, once again for making time. I know in an incredibly busy period, but I was really invaluable to have your perspective and a really outstanding summary of a wide range of issues that were being discussed in the progress. So thank you, Kate. I'm now going to invite Nick Stern to kind of give his kind of take on the COP.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, Kate, for your leadership on all this and your very clear summary. And thank you in particular for joining us when you must be totally exhausted after 3 weeks on the road. And this is only Wednesday and you were back on the Monday. So thank you, Kate, for that. What I have to say is actually quite close in many ways to what Kate has said. So I don't want to cover too much of the ground that she has already spoken about. But it's interesting that without any kind of coordination between us, the take on COP30 was very similar. I've been to all the COPs since 2006, and I think that the atmospherics that Brazil generated, the warmth and friendliness, was significant and was important in the broadly positive or qualified positive outcome that I think we should recognize. I completely agree with Kate that multilateralism could have suffered a real blow. One country, United States, stepped away, but no other countries did. And people came with the spirit of getting on with the job, with the multilateral approach to things. The enthusiasm for the multilateralism was not equal across all countries, but nevertheless, it was there. So we had as it were, a reaffirmation of multilateralism when we could have had a breakdown. And that, I think, is something important, and we should recognize this as a modest step forward when it could have been a disastrous step backwards. And I think that's very important. Like Kate, I think that the reaffirmation of the Paris Agreement was extremely important. And the first 2 pages of the main final decision, as Kate emphasized, is around the support for the Paris Agreement, indeed the celebration of the Paris Agreement. I think we would all recognize if we tried to negotiate a Paris-like agreement now, we would probably not be able to do it. So the fact that we're holding the Paris Agreement together and celebrating it, I think, is of great importance. Let me just give you one example of an obvious implication of the Paris Agreement. An obvious implication of the Paris Agreement of a target of well below 2 degrees and efforts towards 1.5 is that we have to have a strong transition away from fossil fuels. So whether or not it's written down doesn't sound to me to be of overwhelming importance, even though the press made a great deal of it. It's absolutely in the logic of the Paris target of well below 2 degrees and efforts towards 1.5. So that reaffirmation of Paris was very important in the context that we now find ourselves. Looking forward now, and if I could add 1 or 2 more dates to those that Kate specified, we have after the joint Turkey-Australia COP31, we have Ethiopia COP32, and we have India COP33. So we're getting, after the Turkey Australia's story, African leadership, and then South Asian leadership through India. And I think that the Indian COP33, and they did ask us, the Indian delegation asked us to help in that. And I'm sure that Grantham Institute and the Global School of Sustainability will be a big part of that. The Indian delegation asked us to help on COP33, and Modi and Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Starmer had actually discussed that earlier. So I do think that if we take that 3-year time horizon now, we have a chance of working with, of course, the next year, but also with Ethiopia and particularly with India to create something strong 3 years from now. So I think that augurs well for the progress that we can and should be making. And of course, India, I hope, and I guess Ethiopia too, will set all the challenges around climate in the context of sustainable and resilient development. That's what this is all about. It's investment for sustainable and resilient development. We mustn't carve climate away from all that. It's not a separate subject. There's no trade-off there. The drive to the sustainable, resilient economy is the drive for growth and the drive for productivity, and a much better growth model than the dirty, destructive models of the past. And if you'll excuse me, I'll draw attention to the book that was published on November the 5th by LSE Press, which is The Growth Story of the 21st Century, subtitled The Economics and Opportunities of Climate Action. So I think that context of climate within sustainable, resilient development is extremely important. And I think that's gathering ground. And that's very important that it is. And with Ethiopia and India coming, I hope that that is solidified, and we see now climate as much more about a central element in sustainable and resilient development rather than something separate. I think that's going to be helped by the UK G20 presidency in 2027 and the UK presidency of the G7 in 2028. So those coming together, I think, augur well for the picking up on the kind of progress that Kate described. Now, Kate set out very clearly, I think, the all the achievements around the coalitions of the willing arising outside the negotiations. I don't want to repeat those, but I do want to underline them. You know, the tropical forests forever and the carbon markets and the adaptation and the groups building the roadmap for the transition away from fossil fuels and on forests and so on. All of those were very important, and we have to recognize now that the outside the negotiation activities are at least as important as the negotiation activities, but also bearing in mind very strongly that unless we do have a final agreement, the non-negotiating activities will drop away. We have to have the annual reaffirmation of Paris. We have to have the continuing steps forwards within the negotiations in themselves, but also because they sustain the gatherings which deliver the non-negotiated side of the story and the coalitions of the willing. Let me close by saying something about finance. The Brazilian presidency called together 35 or so finance ministers, including India and China. They concentrated on past chairs of COPs and of course, the major countries. And that's the first time that there's been a formal coming together under the presidency of finance ministers. They're not part of the negotiations, but they were called together by the presidency of the COP. And I think that's very significant. And they offered which they released, offered a report which they released during the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF in October, which I think was of great value. There's also on finance the roadmap from Baku to Belém, which came out under the names of the presidencies of COP29 and COP30. Very similar in spirit to the Circle of Finance Ministers report. And I think that was of value. Even both those things, of course, outside the negotiations. But lastly, I want to emphasize that both those reports, the Circle of Finance Ministers and the Baku to Belém roadmap were based on the numbers which we produced with the independent high-level expert group on climate finance. That was co-chaired by myself, Amma Bhattacharya, and Veera Songwe, but the lion's share of the work was driven by Amma Bhattacharya and Eleanor Subaran. And that is a very substantial report. It's 229 pages. If you haven't read it yet, I suggest you concentrate on pages 6 and 7, which are a clear and strong summary. But it tells you and gives you our estimates of the investments necessary in emerging markets and developing countries outside China, the investments necessary there for delivery on Paris. And then it looks at how you can finance those investments. Climate finance is not something separate from the investments. All this is about investing for sustainable and resilient growth. And the climate part of that is what we focused on in our work around the headings of the energy transition, adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, natural capital, and the just transition. So that's climate finance within investment towards sustainable development goals, within investment for sustainable and resilient development. So that's the way we approached it. So having looked at the investment numbers, we said how much can be financed inside, how much outside, and we looked at the breakdown, private sector, multilateral development banks, and other sources of finance, including SDRs, philanthropy, new forms of taxation, voluntary carbon markets, and so on. I do think that was important work. It was based where we are particularly in Grantham Research Institute and the Global School of Sustainability, and it formed the foundation for the other reports. So I've probably got on too long, Bob. That's why you've come on screen, and I should stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. No, you were exactly on time. So thank you very much. We're now going to move on to Jodian Wang, who was involved very much in the discussions around the just transition. So Jodian, over to you, please.
Thanks, Bob. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I feel like it hasn't been that long since we were last debriefing on Baku, and here we are. So I'll briefly talk through a few points, give a reminder to everyone on what the Just Transition Work Program is, where we're standing after 2 years of dialogues, why the Just Transition was such a pivotal lever at COP30, what the proposed Just Transition mechanism was meant to do, the main points of contentions that led to the adoption of the mechanism, and how this reflects more deeply in our work. So firstly, a quick context. The Just Transition Work Program was mandated in Sharm el-Sheikh and then formalized in Dubai. The mission was quite simple. It's to place people, workers, marginalized communities, social protection at the center of climate transitions, and give the Just Transition a permanent institutional home under the subsidiary bodies. So what has happened since its formalization was annual dialogues and ministerial roundtables, shifting it from a relatively side conversation to a recognized work stream within the UNFCCC. Where have we landed after 2 years, and what has it delivered then? So since 2024, we've held 4 dialogues plus 3 ministerials. They each tackled a different entry point into the Just Transition. So the first one looking at social dimensions of nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and long-term strategies. The second one was focused on workforce, skills, labor markets, and social protection. Then earlier this year in Panama, the focus of the third dialogue was on adaptation and resilience as just transition issues, given the predominance of mitigation within just transition debates. And lastly, later in the year in Addis Ababa, there was conversations on just energy transition planning for energy systems and communities. Of course, these are far from all the topics that would be part of the just transition discussion, but it also unveiled, even just after 2 years, a lot about, one, the discrepancies of how a just transition is understood based on local or national contexts, the varied starting points of where countries are transitioning, from and towards. And thirdly, the differentiated impacts and responsibilities that sit at the core of a lot of tensions within multilateral climate governance. But there were also achievements like establishing political legitimacy for the just transition inside the UNFCCC because the movement grew from civil society and then it was institutionalized within this governance framework. And second is it started to build shared language and expectations around what a just transition ought to do, while also learning the differences amongst where people are at when it comes to the just transition. And thirdly, is it created a political momentum for COP30 to move beyond discussions and into an institutional outcome. So why was just transition such a key lever at COP30? As both Nick and Kate has mentioned, COP was framed as this COP of truth, COP of implementation, while at the same time negotiations were stuck on areas like has been mentioned, the fossil fuel transition away roadmap, adaptation finance, and the need to triple it as demanded by developing countries, and the rise of unilateral trade measures, which create an uneven regime within the global political economy. So in this context, and in the midst of these stuckness, just transition became sort of a hinge issue that connected ambition and finance and equity and distributional impacts. And for many global South countries, it was a track where they could insist that any transition away from fossil fuels must come with the social safeguards and equity principles, and core issues such as economic diversification or non-debt inducing finance. And for labor unions and indigenous peoples, it was also one of the only places where languages around rights and participations would appear in formal text and then provide that safeguard as well, so as to prevent the further violation of rights of people. So even when other areas were stalemated, the just transition track, in my opinion, became one of the few that still had a promise of a tangible outcome. The tangible outcome from COP30 being the adoption of a just transition mechanism. So now I'll briefly talk about that. Ahead of COP30, many civil society organizations, largely unified by the Climate Action Network, proposed something called the Belém Action Mechanism, which you might have heard the acronym BAM. It was a global coordination mechanism to kind of act as a single entry point for countries and communities seeking just transition support. It would provide technical assistance on social protection, labor policies, and participatory planning. It helps to kind of coordinate and match finance, especially non-debt inducing ones, without creating a new fund. And lastly, it seeks to embed rights-based standards like labor rights, like free, prior, informed consent, human rights, and rights to a clean and healthy environment across transition planning. Now, this is what was proposed by civil society led by Climate Action Network, with the intention of not creating a new fund, but to form a coordination hub to make an increasingly fragmented just transition landscape more easily navigable. Mid-COP, we saw that G77 plus China, which represents 80% of the global population, formally proposed and to kind of support the establishment of a mechanism, taking up much of this framing, albeit there are discrepancies as well. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind with the adoption of the just transition mechanism, is that there are different interpretations of what the mechanism ought to do. So what were the key contentions then within the Just Transition Work Program, even though eventually we led to the adoption of the mechanism? There are a few fault lines that are worth highlighting. The first one is a mechanism versus an action plan. So while G77 plus China and many civil society groups pushed for a mechanism, something that's more actionable, there were resistance to the term throughout the 2 weeks of COP, from Australia to Japan, Norway, also the UK, and arguing that it would duplicate existing structures, it could take a long time to operationalize, and it lacked a clear funding base. The EU also then proposed something called an action plan, a just transition action plan, which focused more on mapping initiatives and knowledge sharing as opposed to coordination and implementation. For proponents of the mechanism, however, an action plan without a mechanism risked just reproducing precisely the governance fragmentation and complexity overload that opponents wanted to avoid. So we wanted to avoid a proliferation of processes with no clear doorway in for most affected communities and countries. And the second, as people have mentioned, unilateral trade measures was a key focus point in the just transition negotiations as well, but it also spilled over into other areas. It surfaced both in the presidency's consultations and directly within the just transition work stream. Developing countries argued that measures like unilateral trade measures could undermine development, exacerbate poverty, and fundamentally attack the concept of just transitions by shifting the adjustment cost of it to the global south. There were draft texts under the JTWP that had mentions and references to cross-border impacts and climate-related trade measures, but in the final just transition decision, all explicit mentions were removed. And thirdly was around fossil fuels, minerals, and the 1.5 degrees link. There were earlier drafts that referenced integration of outcomes of the global stocktake, including the call to transition away from fossil fuels, and also recognize the harm that can be created by, and also the safeguards that's needed to be established around the extraction and the processing of critical minerals, which would have been the first time where minerals appeared in the UNFCCC decision of any kind. But of course, these were later on dropped in the final text. However, we did see that the final mechanism contained what many observers called some of the most progressive rights-based language framing ever seen in COP outcome, though I think there's still a long way to go. So we ended with an institutional win, which is a mechanism that's anchored in strong rights language, but with more structural economic issues like fossil fuels, the minerals supply chain, and the rights protection within that, and trade that were pushed out or watered down. I see Bob back on the screen, so I'll stop there and we'll welcome questions later on as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jodie-Ann, for that deep dive into the discussions around an expert's insight into the discussions around the just transition and the mechanism that was agreed. So we're going to move on to our final speaker, Timo Leiter, who is at an airport, but I hope is in a position to join us now and to talk to us about the adaptation indicators. Timo, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Bob. Hi, all. I'm
Okay.
just putting on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so you want to see if you can share your screen? Very good.
Okay, good. And yeah, I've just been rushing from the airport, so but here we go. So yeah, in adding to everything we've heard so far, including from Kate, I'm going to present a presentation on the adaptation outcomes. And so starting with a little background. So what was under discussion was the global goal on adaptation, and more precisely the indicators around the goal. So as a little background, you see here the what happened so far. And so the Paris Agreement has a global goal on adaptation, for which parties have decided on a framework 2 years ago. And now the question is, what indicators countries are deciding on to check progress towards this framework. So this was quite a breakthrough in the adaptation negotiations, because the framework for the first time established 11 global adaptation targets. And now the question was, do countries agree on indicators to track progress collectively towards these targets? That's the background that we discussed here. Just had to pause to take a breath because I was carrying 30 kilograms of luggage with me just up the stairs a second ago. And so, yeah, and in this journal article here, you also see the background, how we got to this, like how, reviewing the adaptation negotiations from the Paris Agreement until the framework was adopted. And so going on. Yeah, so then also 2 years ago, an expert group was formulated to develop possible indicators for those 11 targets, which you see here. And I've been facilitating this expert group in the last, actually throughout this year. And we have proposed a list of 100 indicators. And this is the task that we received from the June negotiations to come up with a list of 100 globally applicable indicators. That's important. It's about global applicability, including enabling factors and means of implementation and covering all subcomponents of the targets. So what you see here is an example. The agriculture target, which has 4 subcomponents. So the idea was that for the 11 targets and there overall around 35 subcomponents, there would be indicators to track progress towards them. And previously, we had a list of 500 indicators earlier this year. And it's important, of course, as a background, that tracking adaptation progress is very difficult. Adaptation is closely intertwined with sustainable development and is taking very different shapes and form and covering virtually every sector. So in shortening this list of 500 by 80% to 100, there were a lot of trade-offs involved, which are listed here. And so this list was never kind of a perfect list, but it was a very good basis that countries used in the negotiations here in Belém. And so the list that we as the expert group proposed in September, as you see here, is the number of indicators per target. There were approximately 10 indicators per target. And this is also a question that we frequently receive, like 100 would be a high number, but if you have to cover 35 components, covering everything from food security, water security, health, infrastructure, poverty eradication, cultural heritage, and the entire planning cycle, and all these different components within them, then it's on average just 2 indicators per component. So even so 100 sounds like a high number, that is actually needed to cover the breadth of what the 11 global adaptation targets cover. And so from the indicators that we proposed, what these 2 pie charts show you is the availability of metadata, which means the calculation method to calculate the indicators, and the availability of data. And as you can see, there are only 22 indicators out of the 100 for which both of these are in.
Timo, we seem to have lost you. Well, I'm assuming he will be able to rejoin us at some point from the airport. So what I'm going to suggest, Timo, you're back. Sorry, you
Yes.
you froze on us. So do you want to just rejoin and complete your comments? Yeah. Hello, Timo.
Which, can you still hear me?
I can hear you, but you're yeah. Okay. Do you want to have another go at completing your comments? Hello? It looks like you've frozen again, Timo. So I'm assuming we have one more go. Timo, are you
Yes.
okay? Do you want to have another go? But you're breaking up quite a
Yes.
lot. So why don't you try and finish and then we move on?
Yes. Das Internet ist schlecht. Okay, sorry, I'm continuing here.
Yeah.
So the third decision. Könnt ihr mein Ladegerät holen? Ich muss. Sorry for all of this. I just really got dropped home. So the third decision, actually, we were, I think, here on this slide. So what did parties agree to? And let me enlarge this this slide so that you can actually see. So parties adopted a list of indicators, and this was really a very strong outcome because before that, it really looked as if countries would only take note of an outcome. So one of the large decisions that the COP did take was to adopt this Belém adaptation indicators as a package. And this was made possible by reassuring countries that these indicators don't require any ich hab's okay. And so what you see is that while it was adopted, 41 indicators got deleted. So it's quite a bit of a cut away. And what you see here in the pie chart is, or in the bar chart, is the number of indicators that sustained. So there were a number of indicators which took targets which took quite a large hit. Infrastructure is left with only 2 indicators to assess it globally. Poverty eradication, only 3. Planning also only 3. So some of the components of the global targets are no longer covered by indicators, which is of course a major limitation. And especially the wording of the indicators was changed quite dramatically, which shifted the whole. So some of these are no longer the basis of the expert work. And the second point was the use of indicators. In fact, parties had already made taken quite some decisions on this at the last COP last year. And when they decided that these indicators are meant to assess the global progress, and as you can see here in paragraph 23, that they should allow for aggregation. Strangely, at the beginning of the COP in Belém, some parties questioned these already taken decisions. And now what we have in the decision text is an outright contradiction where one paragraph says that there shall not be an establishment of global standardized methodologies, even though that is, of course, required for global aggregation. And this outright contradicts the text itself and also previous decisions. And we will have to see how this can be dealt with in the future. The third aspect is follow-up work. So as we've seen, quite a number of indicators still require metadata development and data collection. And so it was absolutely necessary to develop, to agree on follow-up work. The text has agreed on kind of a patchwork of different things. But it's not really clear how these 4 different things which you see here interact. So there is something called the Belém to Addis Vision on Adaptation, a 2-year policy alignment process, but it's not clear what is supposed to be aligned with what. There's a task force to be established, but the details are unclear. There's no link to the existing expert group. And then tabular formats are to be developed, but it's also not clear exactly for every indicator or just for a few. So there's quite a bit of cleanup required next year. And to conclude, I've 2 slides explaining what happened in the plenary. What felt like yesterday. This was really a drama unlike anything I have witnessed in the 8 COPs I've participated in. So what we saw was that the COP president gabbled through what they refer to as the package of decisions, and he gabbled that through in very high speed. And after he had gabbled through, a number of countries took the floor and actually objected to the decisions. First on 2 decisions, the GGA, the Global Goal Annotation, and the Mitigation Work Program. And tellingly, these were more than 30 countries, and they were from across Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. And I must say, this is very rare. I've never seen the EU object in plenary. Typically, of course, these texts are agreed to beforehand. There can be huddles in a plenary, but an outright rejection of this scale, I have never witnessed. And so what then happened was that the session was suspended, but legally the decisions had been adopted because the COP president had gabbled them through. And the dissolution, so at that moment, it was really unclear if the whole COP would fall apart. It was very, very dramatic. Everybody was fanatically trying to reach some international lawyers to see what could be done. There could have been different avenues, but eventually it was decided to basically move ahead. So the president apologized for not having been made aware that his language and he quoted the lack of sleep and his age. And so the resolution was simply that these 2 decisions actually be further discussed in Bonn, which in practice makes very little difference, because they would have been discussed anyway. And this is my final slide. And I think this is very important to understand the COP and what unfolded. So what we saw in the second week, this affected all agenda items of the COP, is that President Lula's visit on Wednesday of week 2 basically absorbed the capacity in the presidential team. One of the results was that the decision text came super late. We only got the decision text Friday morning, and then there was hardly any discussion of them. There were only bilaterals, no full negotiation, and that led to quite some frustration on behalf of parties. And so the presidency claims all parties had agreed to the text, but actually only the Mujirao text was discussed in the final night. And so the objection by the parties was on substance as much as on process. And so what's really important for future COP presidents is to kind of not overplay their powers as the presidency and to learn from the incidents we've seen here in Brazil. Yeah, so much as a short overview on adaptation, and happy to answer any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim, particularly for coping with the challenges of being at an airport and collecting your luggage and clearly trying to do it. So thank you very much, and indeed for that expert insight into the background as well as the drama of what happened in that final plenary, which, as you say, was kind of extraordinary. I'd not seen anything like that in all the COPs I'd been to, certainly from a final plenary. Good. Okay. At this point, we are now going to move to Q&A from the audience. You can still add questions in the Q&A section, but we already have a good number. So I'm going to put them to the members of the panel who remain. Kate, as I mentioned, had to leave us. So perhaps if Timo, Jodianne and Nick can rejoin, turn their cameras on, we can go through some of these questions. So I'm going to start with a question from Tim Bushell, who asks, so often communication at the level of the general public gets lost on these events. Who does the panel think made the best showing of being able to communicate the details with the general public? And as ever, although the final plenary was broadcast live and for free on the UNFCCC's own channels, I think most people probably relied on the media coverage, which often focuses on the drama of the events and less on the substance. So, but be interested to hear the views of the panel on how best to communicate the decisions and what was discussed at the at COP. So who wants to go first on that question? Jodianne, do you want to have a go first and then maybe Nick?
Yeah, I think even for us on the ground, it's really difficult to keep track of everything that's going on beyond maybe a singular negotiation track at most. I think if I understand the question correctly, for people who want to tune into the intricacies of how these things are working, but to kind of also not get caught up in the often inaccessible or quite highly technical language, I do recommend following Earth Negotiation Bulletin, which provides a daily update on what's happening in the room. And as always, like Carbon Brief does a quite comprehensive readout of everything that went down at COP, and it's very navigable by negotiation tracks. But it is a really valid question in terms of, I think we all need to do better at making these more accessible and relevant for everyone so as to understand the urgency of what we're dealing with outside of these 2 weeks.
Thanks, Jodianne. Nick, do you want to add something?
I would agree with Jodianne, and she probably was following things in the press and the social media and so on much better than I was. I do find Carbon Brief helpful on these issues. In the UK press and media, I must say I found Polita Clark to be very good, and in particular, she got that balance between the non-negotiating side and the negotiating side, I thought, rather well. And so I thought her reporting was very good. The BBC, I felt, was a little bit, dramatically focused on the negotiations themselves. I think Justin, was in the Amazon, for much of it and came back towards the end. but nevertheless, the BBC is pretty good. And Fiona Harvey in The Guardian, I thought, also. But there was a tendency to over dramatize the final negotiations and the arm wrestling, a bit like they've all been to see the Kyoto play and want to pick up that kind of drama. And as I said, for an overall more detailed story, Carbon Brief I found helpful. And I thought, and in terms of the journalism that I read, I found Peter Clark's descriptions particularly helpful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it is, as Jodie Ann mentioned, a real challenge even for people involved in negotiation who are in the venue to understand what's going on. I do feel that always out of this, the coverage tends to be a lot more negative. We should remember that, and I think Kate made this point very clear, this is a process which works by consensus between 194 countries. So although progress is often slow, I think if you ask yourself, on what other issue could you even get 194 countries in the room to even have a discussion? That's a rather short list at the moment, given the state of the world affairs. So the fact that so much gets achieved at these COPs is really a testimony that it does remain the commitment, notwithstanding the fact that Donald Trump and the Americans decided they didn't want to be there. The fact that everybody else got on with it and they reached agreements on so many issues is itself an indicator that this is still a powerful process, albeit too slow given the urgency of the issues. So we'll move on to the next question. And maybe Nick, if you want to come back on this particular question. This is from an anonymous question. What would it take for China to support ambition at COP? Given its economic interest and advantage in selling green tech to the world and a clear understanding of the risks of inaction, they flirted with leadership in Baku but seemed to back off in Belém. So, Nick, do you want to come back on that issue?
Yeah, it's not clear to me that it's accurate that China backed off in Belém. I mean, for example, they did take part in the Circle of Finance Ministers. They did support the Open Coalition on carbon markets. I think Kate mentioned one or two other areas as well. So outside the negotiations, I think China actually moved forward quite a lot. In private discussions, and obviously I can't go into the detail, but we talked to the head of delegation, and they really were looking forward in a very positive way. Partly because I think they now recognize very clearly that they are leaders in the world in terms of the weight of their overall economy and the weight of their overall emissions, and that the way in which their technological advance has been moving has given them confidence. Another aspect, I think, which gave them more confidence to be explicit, or more explicit, I should say, explicit is too strong, more explicit, was the fact that they now have the 15th five-year plan more or less done. And the 15th five-year plan is the most important piece of activity on the climate in the world, because China is the biggest emitter, and the 15th five-year plan sets out their plans for 26 to 30. China has probably peaked its emissions. Discussions with our friends working on China suggest they peaked the emissions last year. Now, whether it's last year or next year is not critical. What does matter now is the pace at which they reduce. And they've said that from the peak, they would expect to reduce 7 to 10% by 2035. That's roughly then, I think, off the numbers where they are now, and that they would strive to do better. And again, I check with my Chinese friends, and that's people on the call, maybe Jodie Ann, who I don't speak any Chinese, but I was assured that strive, when translated into Chinese, was quite a strong word, as it is in English. Is that nodding, Jodie Ann? Yeah, okay. So for all those reasons, I think that it's not right to see China as stepping back. If anything, I would say China is edging. I don't want to be too strong, but China is edging forward in its leadership.
Thank you very much, Nick. Jodiane or Timo, do you want to add anything to that? Oh, no. Okay, very good. Okay, we will move on to the next question. Again, anonymous. How do we reconcile national determination with the call for roadmaps? And there were two roadmaps in particular that the presidency offered to lead on, one on forest protection of forests and one on the transition away from fossil fuels. Is there a plan for what those roadmaps will actually contain? So I don't know whether anybody has any greater insight than what was actually said in the final plenary. There'd been a discussion about the need for the final decision to include some language around the transition away from fossil fuels. In the end, the language was implicit by a reference to the UAE outcome, which in itself had made an explicit commitment to the transition, or explicit reference to the transition away from fossil fuels. But there was nothing that came out of that. There is, however, going to be a summit, which will be co-chaired by the Netherlands and Colombia, around the need for a transition away from fossil fuels. So it does appear that there's an emergence of a group of a kind of more ambitious countries on that who are going to lead the charge, even though it was clear that some of the big fossil fuel producers didn't want that language, to see that language in the final decision of the COP. Has anybody else got any other insights on the roadmap that they want to offer? No.
I
Okay.
think there are.
Yeah, sorry.
You go ahead, Timo. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think there are no real details yet, but these roadmaps are kind of can be powerful tool, and the power is twofold. First, that countries agree and commit to something. I mean, these roadmaps will establish aims, policy aims, and as Kate said, sometimes we have to move ahead in a coalition of the willing. The consensus-based structure doesn't allow us to go as far as we need to go. And so it's important not just what's in the decision text, but also these additional initiatives. And having a coalition of 80 countries, that's quite strong. And the second powerful kind of lever is that once such a roadmap is in place, it puts pressure on countries to look into these issues and to engage. So it creates quite of a global initiative, and more countries are signing up. It goes to the ministers. The ministers ask the bureaucracy, okay, what can we do? What can we add? So the power of such roadmaps, if they're done well and enjoy the support that they do seem to enjoy, should not be underestimated. And to add a final point, the Brazilian presidency said that they do not want to be a bureaucratic presidency, but an active one. And Brazil still holds the presidency up until the beginning of COP31. So we can see, and we will see, that these two roadmaps, which are very important to the President Lula da Silva, will play an important role next year.
Thank you very much, Timo. Excellent. Okay, we'll move on.
One thing. There's an apparent logical contradiction implied in the questions in relation to the idea of the nationally determined contribution and the roadmap. And I think that's a false conflict or a false distinction. The nationally determined contribution is what it says. It's the way in which the country feels that its own development path, and the NDC is a development path, it's not something separate from that, that how its own development path will embody emissions reductions and other aspects of the Paris Agreement. But we all make our decisions for our development paths, which are shaped by investment. And it's key to keep bringing investment into this, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, or development, or usually all three. That investment is going to be shaped by where you think the world economy is going. Whether you follow Keynes or von Hayek or whatever, investment is influenced by expectations. So the roadmaps are there in large measure to help people understand what other people are doing or what other people might be motivated to do. and that would in turn influence investment decisions. And this is exactly as it should be for something which is in its logic a global endeavor. So I see no tension or contradiction there at all.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A about finance relating to the numbers. If you go to the website, the Grantham Research Institute, you'll be able to find the report of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, in which the numbers are explained in great detail. So I recommend anybody who wants details about that to do that. We'll move on now.
Hurry, if you're in a hurry, pages 6 and 7, Bob.
Yeah, there's a
Not
2-page
229.
summary, a 10-page summary, and then the actual report of close to 200 pages, depending on how much time you want to spend. Okay, we're going to move on.
229.
Yes. Fernanda Kamara has asked, and this is a question for you, Jodian, how do you see the concept of a just transition evolving in upcoming COP negotiations and global climate agendas, particularly in relation to the integration of social and human rights dimensions? And from your perspective, what direction will the just transition agenda take in the future COPs? I'm sure that's quite a detailed question. If you could kind of give a summary answer, Jodian.
Yeah. I think the just transition started from the recognition of the labor-related challenges that will come with the transition to now, naturally, after 10 years in the Paris Agreement, something much bigger. And I think that this is something that the just transition work under the UNFCCC will need to reckon with, because it's not only about from point A to point B and the people who are implicated in that, but also about the uneven starting points and the broader political economy that countries are engaged in, which is, how trade, debt, and industrial policies are disciplined through existing global rules and whether they are conducive to fair transitions for everyone. And we're seeing that come up as key, very contentious points in the negotiations. And the establishment of the mechanism allows the just transition work to go from a place where grievances and challenges and priorities are discussed to something that's a bit more operational. And I think we need to get operational in order for the program and the agenda and the issue itself to have teeth and have leverage on progress in other negotiation tracks as well. So with the rights-based language, of course, it has to be its core. There's no kind of debate around that, in my opinion. But what we're seeing that was achieved at COP, which is, I think, is a new governance setup to make the just transition more real moving forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Jodian. Okay, let me move on to another question here, which is a question here on nature, ocean, and ecosystem. Could you share from Ellen Chang? Could you share some views on the development of nature agendas, ocean and ecosystem restoration topics during COP30? Will the Blue NDC Challenge become a crucial enabler for the ocean agenda? I'm not sure whether anybody was following on the panel was particularly following this aspect, but one thing that is probably worth mentioning is that at the moment, there's no real explicit link connecting the UNFCCC negotiation process and its kind of sister UN treaty, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which has been making great progress. And there are obvious great overlaps between the nature agenda and the climate agenda, particularly around issues around adaptation, but also mitigation as well. And there is scope for probably looking at how those two conventions can move forward and reinforce each other, even though they are separate independent processes. And the last thing you want to do is try and build any formal interconnections between two uniquely complicated individual UN processes, even though they are covering issues that are overlapping. Does anybody else from the panel want to offer a view? Yeah,
I do think on the oceans front, there's a lot of progress and movement outside of the negotiation rooms, and the COP is the negotiations, but it's a lot of the engagement on the margins of it, and we shouldn't ignore that as well. I think there's a big push on the oceans agenda and calling for kind of ocean climate solutions. Great work led by like Sustainable Oceans Alliance and others that we need to take into account as well.
Very good. Thank you. Timo, you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, so when it comes to kind of the formal text, there are some limits because the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement are non-sector specific agreements. The only exception is food security and agriculture, which is recognized in the convention from 1994. But countries are very cautious, kind of not to create kind of formal agenda items on different topics. It's more kind of dialogue forums. And now in Belém, we had the Mountain Dialogue, which is spearheaded by Kyrgyzstan, Bhutan, and others. At COP25 in Madrid, there was oceans were an important focus area, but we wouldn't expect kind of formal decisions outside of the cover decision on these topics. But then, as Jodie said, what's very important is everything that happens around the formal negotiations in the action agenda. And a lot can take place in that space, which really is it can be almost equally important than the negotiations themselves.
Thank you very much indeed, Timo. Okay, we'll move on to another question from Lilia Akatova. What can we expect to see high on the agenda of COP31, considering the Turkey-Australia logistical arrangement and the COP30 outcomes? And so for those who weren't aware, the agreement for COP31 is that it will be held in Antalya in Turkey. Turkey will be the COP presidency, but Australia will take on the role of president of negotiations, which is a new innovation, should we say, as far as the COP process is. So one that we'll see. There will be a pre-COP in the Pacific region to highlight those issues relating specifically to the Pacific nation. So does anybody have a sense of what are going to be? Are there any key issues driven by the timetable of the articles of the Paris Agreement that we know will have to be discussed in COP31? Anybody want to offer a view? Timo first.
So first, just to explain that the COP rotates across the 5 UN regional areas. And so next year's turn is the European Western Group and others. And so Australia had a 3-year campaign to get the COP to Australia together with the Pacific Islands. And that's what everybody expected. But this is one of the very unexpected things that happened in week 2. Turkey did not back down. This decision has to be taken by consensus. If these 2 countries wouldn't have agreed last week, it would have by default gone to Bonn, Germany, but apparently Germany had no appetite to host the COP again, and Bonn cannot cope with 50,000. So the very surprising outcome was it's going to be in Turkey and under the Turkish presidency with some arrangement that Australia will lead some negotiations. In terms of the topics, of course, mitigation and the ambition and keeping 1.5 alive will feature and should feature very prominently. We will see how these roadmaps further develop. It is difficult to foresee kind of consensus on the roadmaps, but the Brazilian presidency will spearhead these roadmaps. Finance is, of course, always a topic. And then in terms of the processes under the Paris Agreement, the second global stocktake will conclude in 2028, but the technical phase will start next year. And so there will be some kind of the start of the global stocktake process will also happen in Turkey.
Thank you very much, Timo. Giuliano, Nick.
I think that the roadmaps should actually produce something for the next COP, and it would be very odd if the people leading those roadmaps thought that they had longer than a year to make the next statement. I mean, it could be, of course, a mechanism that continues, and I would hope that it would be. But I think we should expect those 2 roadmaps to come back. And I think that's the transition away from fossil fuels and forests. And I think that the circle of finance ministers will continue. And we've certainly encouraged our Brazilian friends to continue that innovation because it was very, very important.
Very good. Thank you. Jodie.
And on the just transition front, the work program was scheduled to wind down by the end of next year, which was why there was such a big push this year for the mechanism. So we're expecting that by SB64 next year, there will be draft decisions on what we ought to do with the mechanism for adoption by COP31. So that's also a space to watch as well.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to another question. Can you comment on the role of China, India, and the EU throughout the COP? I think Nick had already addressed the issue of China's role, but does anybody want to offer a view on India and the EU, maybe in relation specifically to the adaptation indicators and the just transition, or more generally? So, Timo.
Yes, so the EU, and this is what the EU Climate Commissioner said at the outset, the EU was looking for strong mitigation commitments, especially from G20 countries. And it said that this would be a requirement for the EU to then, on its side, kind of commit more to adaptation finance. I know that the EU feels that in the last couple of COPs, it has always given in to demands for more finance, but got relatively little in return on mitigation ambitions. And I do hear that, or I have heard that the talks were actually close to a collapse in the final night on the Mujirao decision because the European Union thought it wouldn't get enough in turn for agreeing for the tripling to adaptation finance. And so the compromise was that because there wasn't more ambition from developing countries, especially countries in transition, China and India and the Arab states on mitigation, the tripling for adaptation finance is not by 2030, but by 2035, and it's not a commitment. It only says calls for efforts. But yeah, the EU had been looking for stronger mitigation outcomes, and the EU supported both of these roadmaps.
Thank you, Timo. Anybody else want to come in here?
Bob, could I add to
Yeah,
what
Nick,
Timo
yeah.
said? And I'm sure it's what Amar would have said if he had been with us. If you look at the numbers in our independent high-level expert group on climate finance, the investment numbers for adaptation and resilience in the overall 3.2 trillion that we estimate for 2035 are in the region of 300 or 400 billion. And the tripling, and Timo's on top of these numbers, but the tripling would fall far short of that. So the idea that sort of tripling was a bit sort of over the odds seems to me to be a bit rich in relation to what the necessary numbers for adaptation would turn out to be, bearing in mind that adaptation would require a higher fraction of external finance than mitigation, because so much of mitigation can be sort of private sector investment in generation and so on. So I do think on adaptation, we have to, over this year, really press the case that the numbers are involved are more than the tripling, involve considerably more than tripling.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take one more question, and it's again anonymous. So, do you think the US decision not to participate in COP influenced the ambition of other countries in positive or negative ways? Now, we should just explain that actually the US could have participated. It hasn't yet completed withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And even when it does, it will still be a party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change anyway, which is essentially the negotiations are 3 negotiations all at the same time, one by parties to the original 92 convention, one to the 97, 98 Kyoto Protocol, and one to the Paris Agreement. So, but anybody want to comment on whether the absence or presence of official US government? We should mention that there were lots of Americans there, including Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, was present there, and several other, some senators participated remotely, but it wasn't like there were no Americans there, but there was certainly no official US government delegation. So does anybody want to comment on whether that was a good or bad thing? Nick?
I think, Bob, that the absence of the US and some declining enthusiasm around this issue are correlated. And I don't think that we should see the US withdrawal as the sole or perhaps even the primary factor in the caution that you see. And I think it's fair to say there was increased caution on ambition, as Kate noted, and all of us have drawn attention to. Partly, I think all this comes from whereas in Paris we were looking ahead and saying what we should do, and now 10 years on from Paris, we're involved in the detail of what we are doing, which is quite a lot, as many of us have noticed. And then the practicalities of the action, of course, are real. And, you get issues of a just transition that Jodianne was talking about, which are actually occurring rather than anticipating them when we were sitting in Paris. So I do think that it's understandable that the management of change should cause difficulties for people when you're in the process of change. At the same time, I do think that the spectacular technological advances that we've seen were not anticipated in Paris. So some parts of the story have become easier than we thought they would. None of it's easy, but some parts of the story have become easier. So I think we have to put that opportunity side together with, the practicalities of change and experiencing disruption and difficulty now rather than just anticipating it. Together with the bandwidth that we've associated with the consequences of war around the world, particularly Russia, Ukraine, and so on. So I think all these things have their causation, and which beyond simply what's happened in the United States, which of course is, to put it mildly, unhelpful. So I think you have to think and try to understand all these things coming together and not put it down just to that one aspect of the US. It certainly was less quarrelsome because the US was there. That's a modest plus.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Was not there.
Yeah, thank you. Timo.
Yes, I mean, before the COP, there was quite some concern whether the United States, the current administration, will put countries under pressure, as they've done in the International Maritime Organization, where recently they led to the collapse of an already otherwise agreed, was it a kind of a carbon tax on emissions from ships? So this does not seem to have happened. We've also seen at the G20 summit just now in Joburg, there was a closing declaration by all the remaining 19 countries, and apparently the US had not expected that. So it was good that they were not there under the Trump administration, because in theory they could have blocked everything because they are still a party to the Paris Agreement at this moment. And the absence of the United States, of course, changes power dynamics. There are groups which would have otherwise, been put in check by the strong power of the US, but the US was not in the room. So I was in some negotiation rooms where, let's say, the Arab group could kind of almost dictate the text, and there was no other power to block them. So it does have implications. But as Nick said, it's not the only factor that would drive other countries' ambitions. But yeah, it's really strange. Like you said, the most powerful country on earth, militarily, economically, suddenly disappears. It's very strange.
Thank you very much. Jodianne, do you want to come in with a final word on this? No. Okay. Yeah. I think
I would just add one qualification. I don't think it's the most powerful country on earth economically. I mean, if you look at purchasing power parity and so on, China's been bigger for quite some time. Militarily, I guess it's still true.
Yeah. Very good. And we do remember there was a time when the US used to participate in the negotiation process and were actively obstructive. And so at least we are not back to those days when it used to be having to work around the Americans. So excellent. Okay, well, we've come to the end of this event. Thank you to all of our panelists for their insights and efforts. Particular thanks to Kate Hughes for joining us so soon after returning and what was obviously a grueling 3 weeks for her. But thank you to each of the panelists. Thank you to the audience for an excellent set of questions. And we now look forward to COP31 in Antalya next year. And we will no doubt have another similar event after that, hopefully to survey the progress that was made there. This event, the recording will be made available on the Grantham Research Institute website. So if you want to go over it again or share it with your friends, please check back then. But until the next one, thank you all and goodbye.